On December 20th, 1995, at Miami International Airport, American Airlines Flight 965 was not a particularly special flight. It was just a routine night flight, carrying a familiar flight number, connecting the United States with the city of Cali, Colombia. A Boeing 757-200, a type of aircraft considered highly reliable in the 1990s, was prepared for the journey across the Caribbean Sea over the complex mountainous terrain of Western Colombia before landing. But from the very beginning, this flight was out of sync. According to the original schedule, Flight 965 was expected to take off nearly 2 hours earlier. Such a delay is not rare in the aviation industry, especially during the year-end season when flight volume increases and every link in the system is under pressure. For passengers, a delay is just a longer wait. For the airline, it is an operational headache. But for those who understand how this industry works, a delay is always a silent signal. It erodes the buffer time, which is precious when things do not go according to plan. When Flight 965 finally taxied onto the Miami runway, the context had changed. It was no longer a flight departing at the ideal time, but a flight that had to chase the clock. The flight crew entered the cockpit with the awareness that they were late, that a long journey lay ahead, and that the destination was notoriously difficult to access, especially at night. No one said it out loud, but in this industry, everyone understands. When time is taken away on the ground, it often returns to create pressure in the air. The Boeing 757 left Miami in the night, heading south. Technically, everything followed procedure. The aircraft operated normally, the navigation systems were ready, and the crew followed the approved flight plan. However, the delay caused the flight to approach Cali at a much later hour than expected. This led to an important consequence. The air traffic in the Cali area was no longer as clear as during the day, and every decision had to be made faster and more concisely. Cali was not an easy airport. It sits in a valley, surrounded by mountains. During the day, that terrain is clearly visible. At night, everything becomes just numbers on a screen and short commands from air traffic control. For flights arriving on time, the crew usually has enough time to prepare their mindset and organize the approach steps. For Flight 965, that safety margin had significantly thinned. The nearly 2-hour delay did not cause the accident, but it placed the flight in a vulnerable position. It caused all subsequent maneuvers to take place under compressed time conditions. In aviation, there is rarely a single cause. Accidents are usually the result of many small factors occurring in succession. And very often, that chain starts with something seemingly harmless: a delay. From the perspective of someone who has followed this industry for over 3 decades, I can say this is a familiar scenario. It is not because the pilots lacked competence, nor because the aircraft had a problem. It is because the modern aviation system operates like a clockwork machine. When one gear turns slower than expected, other gears are forced to compensate. This compensation isn't always wrong, but it reduces the margin of safety. Flight 965 left Miami late, entered Colombian airspace late, and approached Cali in a less favorable time frame. This isn't written as a line in a technical report, but it was present in every decision thereafter. In my years as an aviation journalist, I have seen many incidents where the starting point was simply a flight that didn't take off on time. No one views it as the cause, but those in the profession understand. It is the first domino. Flight 965 began like thousands of other flights. There were no warning signs, nothing abnormal in the conventional sense. But from the moment it left Miami nearly 2 hours late, it had stepped out of its ideal trajectory. And in an industry where everything is designed for the smallest possible margin of error, just a slight deviation at the starting point can lead to a vastly different final result. A quiet night and an unforgiving land. As Flight 965 left the Florida coast and moved south, the context of the flight became clearer. On board were people returning to Colombia for the end of the year, a time when flight schedules are dense and international routes are in a state of soft overload. This was not a leisurely tourist flight or a rushed business trip. It was a flow of people returning home, a familiar movement in the aviation industry that I have witnessed for decades. Year-end flights, quiet but heavy with pressure. The important point is this: the circumstances of the flight did not appear bad in any easily recognizable way. On paper, everything looked fine. The weather along the flight path was favorable, with no major storms or significant turbulence. That night was not a bad weather night, and it is precisely that calmness that often makes humans more complacent than necessary. But aviation is not just about weather. It is about terrain, operational habits, and risks that lie dormant until someone touches them. Cali is a prime example. This city is not located on an open plateau or a wide plain. Its airport is nestled in a valley, surrounded by high, steep mountains that are pitch black at night. During the day, pilots can read the terrain by sight. At night, everything exists only on screens, maps, and professional memory. With familiar flights, this isn't an issue. But for a flight arriving late and approaching in a less than ideal time frame, the level of complexity increases markedly. In over 30 years of monitoring this industry, I have realized one thing. Serious accidents rarely happen in clearly dangerous conditions. They often occur when everything on the surface looks fine. No rain, no storms, no red alerts. Just a difficult airport, unforgiving terrain, and a flight trying to catch up with a delayed schedule. The terrain around Cali does not allow for a large margin of error. Approach paths are designed to keep aircraft within narrow corridors, away from mountain slopes. When followed correctly, they work effectively. But if an aircraft deviates from that corridor, even slightly, the consequence is not a matter of simple readjustment. There is not much room for error. Notably, that night, the good weather became a distracting factor. When weather is bad, people are usually more cautious. When it is good, the pace of work tends to become faster and more streamlined. No one intentionally acts sloppily, but decisions are often made under the assumption that everything is under control. In aviation, an assumption is the most dangerous thing if not continuously verified. Flight 965 was entering an area where familiarity is crucial. Local air traffic, navigation points, and the way landmarks are named are all highly localized. For crews flying into Cali frequently, it is a difficult but familiar airport. For infrequent flights, especially arriving at night, it demands high concentration and strict adherence to every step. The circumstances of the flight at this point were an intersection of three factors: a delayed flight, a quiet weather night, and a destination that is unforgiving of mistakes. None of those factors alone were enough to cause a disaster. But when placed together, they created a high-risk backdrop in post-accident investigations. People often ask, why didn't they realize it sooner? The answer usually lies in the context. When everything looks normal, humans tend to believe they are on the right track. And when the terrain is not visible, a deviation only exists in the form of numbers, symbols, or a thin line on a screen. The situation of Flight 965 was not a series of dramatic events. It was a quiet context, even somewhat familiar to the aviation industry. But it is that very familiarity that is terrifying. It makes the risk invisible until there is no way back. If there is one thing to take away from this part of the story, it is this. In aviation, there is no such thing as an absolutely quiet night. There are nights without wind or rain that are still full of traps. And for Flight 965, the terrain around Cali was that silent trap, waiting for a small deviation to turn a normal situation into something irrecoverable. When the digital compass slipped, moving into the approach phase for Cali, Flight 965 entered the part of the job that requires the highest discipline. Managing a flight path in a confined space at night amidst terrain that allows for no guessing. After the first two parts, a delayed flight and a difficult destination, the story begins to shift from context to action. And in aviation, just one action out of sync can cause everything behind it to slide. To save time and simplify the approach, the crew accepted a direct routing. In theory, this was not an unusual decision. For many airports, going direct helps reduce workload, save fuel, and gets the aircraft onto the approach axis quickly. But for Cali, going direct is never simple. It is like cutting through an old neighborhood via a dark alley instead of following the pre-drawn main road. When choosing to go direct, the navigation system on the Boeing 757 needs to have the waypoints re-entered. This is a familiar task for modern pilots, but familiarity does not mean immunity to error. The system does not understand intent. It only does exactly what is input. And in the cockpit that night, between time pressure and complex terrain, a sequence of seemingly small maneuvers changed the entire picture. Some critical navigation points were deleted from the system. This was not due to a malfunction, nor a lack of knowledge. It was the result of editing the flight path while the aircraft was moving fast toward the airport as the workload increased by the minute. When a point is deleted, the system doesn't sound a loud alarm. It just quietly updates the new flight path, like a map that just had several important landmarks erased. The problem here was not pressing the wrong button. The problem was that after the waypoint disappeared, the entire concept of the aircraft's actual position became blurred. The pilots still saw the plane flying steadily, speed normal, no shaking. But what they didn't see was that the aircraft was no longer within the safe corridor designed for that area. That I in the aviation industry, I always tell young colleagues, spatial disorientation doesn't always look like it does in the movies, where everything is chaotic and alarms are blaring. Most of the time, it is very quiet. The plane is still flying, the engines are still steady, and the numbers on the screen still look reasonable, except they are no longer true to the reality outside. When the waypoints were deleted, the crew had to rely more on the electronic system to redraw the path. But electronics cannot replace situational awareness if the input data is wrong. This is a classic trap of the transition era between traditional and digital flying. Humans believe the system is leading them correctly, while the system is only following unverified commands. It is noteworthy that no single moment in this phase was considered gravely wrong if viewed in isolation. Every maneuver had a reason. Every decision seemed reasonable in the context of being late and wanting a fast approach. But when pieced together, they created a massive deviation, not in speed or altitude, but in heading. I have read hundreds of accident reports, and this is the most terrifying commonality. Humans often don't realize they have drifted off course until they have few options left. Flight 965 didn't lose control. It lost the map. And in the area around Cali, losing the map means leaving your fate to the terrain. The modern navigation system is very powerful, but it is not a supervisor. It doesn't ask back, "Are you sure?" It just executes. When a critical point is deleted, it doesn't remind you that the point's role was to keep the plane away from the mountainside. It just draws a new, shorter, more direct, and more dangerous path. From the perspective of someone who has followed this industry for over 30 years, I see this not as a story of individual incompetence. It is a story of how humans interact with technology under pressure. When time is compressed, when the destination is difficult, and when electronic systems become the center of decision-making, a small deviation can be very well hidden until it reveals itself in a way no one wants. Flight 965 was no longer where the pilots thought it was. And the most dangerous thing was, there was no clear sign of that, at least in the first few minutes. In aviation, that is the moment an accident begins to take shape. Not noisy, not dramatic, just an aircraft flying the right way, on the wrong road. One name the same, a completely different direction. After the navigation system on Flight 965 was scrambled, the story entered a more dangerous phase. It was no longer about missing a landmark, but choosing the wrong one. In aviation, this is a huge difference. Missing a landmark makes one confused. Choosing the wrong landmark makes one falsely confident. As the crew tried to bring the Boeing 757 back to a familiar trajectory, they looked for a familiar-sounding name, Roseau. For flights into Cali, this is a critical navigation point, located right on the safe approach axis. But the problem with navigation systems of that era is something many outside the industry cannot imagine. The same name can exist in multiple places, with different identifiers. The computer does not understand geographic intent. It only understands characters. When the pilot entered Roseau, the system offered several choices. One of them was nowhere near Cali. It was in a completely different direction. And in that decisive moment, the crew chose wrong. There was no warning bell, no red message. The system accepted the choice coldly and immediately recalculated the new flight path. From the perspective inside the cockpit, the plane began to turn in a direction that seemed reasonable. Every parameter was still within limits. But on the actual map, the 757 had left the safe approach axis and was quietly drifting toward an area not designed for an aircraft at that altitude. A deviation of more than 10 miles is not a small number during the approach phase. At high altitude, 10 miles might just be an error margin. But when a plane is descending amidst vertical mountain ranges, 10 miles is another world. It is the boundary between controlled space and the land where the terrain takes command. The scariest thing here was not the wrong turn, but the feeling of rightness. As the plane turned per the new command, everything in the cockpit looked very smooth. Air traffic control was still talking normally. The system did not object. And the pilots, accustomed to trusting electronic data, had no immediate reason to doubt that I have witnessed many cases where the most dangerous mistake is not a spontaneous act, but an act supported by the system. When technology confirms your choice, you tend to believe you are on the right path. That is the greatest trap of the digital flight era. Confidence nurtured by false data. Cali at night does not reveal its terrain. The mountains do not glow. There were no natural signs to remind them the plane was heading where it shouldn't be. If it were day, this deviation might have been noticed sooner. At night, everything is behind a screen. And when the screen only shows a smooth flight path, humans easily overlook the most important question. Is this path actually correct? Choosing the wrong Rosso was not a stupid mistake. It was a consequence of system design, time pressure, and how humans interact with selection lists on a screen. In the 1990s, many navigation systems were not yet designed to protect users from valid but dangerous choices. The computer didn't say, "This point is valid, but it doesn't fit the airport you are approaching." It just said, "This point exists." When Flight 965 deviated more than 10 miles from the approach path, it entered a zone where mistakes no longer had much room to be fixed. There, every subsequent decision was dominated by the terrain. The space to adjust gradually vanished. The time to realize the error was also much shorter. From the perspective of a journalist who has followed the aviation industry for over 3 decades, I see this as a bitter lesson about small details. A similar name, a different identifier, and a button press in the cockpit can bend an entire flight path. No bad weather needed. No mechanical failure needed. Just a system that allows a wrong choice without forcing the user to stop and reflect. Flight 965 was now not just disoriented. It was being led in a very logical way according to computer logic. And when humans follow that logic without the safe map as an anchor, the aircraft had come very close to the boundary where a mistake no longer has a chance to be corrected. 12 seconds too late, after all the previous deviations. The delay, the difficult terrain, the lost milestones, the wrong point. Flight 965 finally entered the moment the aviation industry calls the mandatory awakening. That is when the system is no longer silent. In the cockpit, the GPWS, ground proximity warning system, alert blared. No long-windedness, no debate, just a harsh, decisive signal reporting that the aircraft was approaching the ground too closely. In over 30 years of following aviation cases, I can say plainly, when the GPWS speaks up, you have already gone very deep into the danger zone. It is not a predictive system. It is a reactive system when everything is already at the limit. The remaining time is measured in seconds, not minutes. It is not an opportunity to reanalyze the whole situation. There is only enough time to do the only thing left to do: pull the plane up. The pilots reacted correctly per professional instinct. Thrust was increased. The nose of the aircraft pitched up. The Boeing 757 tried to escape the approaching slope. On paper, this was the standard response. In reality, it was not enough. The reason did not lie with the engine. It did not lie with the weather. It lay in a very normal technical detail, easily overlooked in the previous chain of stress. The speed brakes were still extended. Speed brakes are tools used to reduce speed and altitude during an approach. When extended, they help hold the plane back, like pulling a handbrake when a car is going downhill. But when a rapid climb is needed, they become drag. The aircraft can still increase thrust, but the climbing efficiency is significantly eroded. In an ideal situation, speed brakes must be retracted as soon as an escape maneuver begins. But Flight 965 was not in an ideal situation. Preceding this was a sequence of frantic maneuvers: editing the flight path, determining position, communicating with air traffic control. When the alarm blared, everything happened too fast. There was no perfect checklist, only reflexes. The 757 tried to climb, but it was like a person trying to run up a hill with a wide-open windbreaker. It had power, but the drag held it back. The distance to the mountainside was shorter than the remaining climb capability. It is important to understand here, this was not a failure of individual skill. It was a failure of the timeline. By the time they recognized the danger, they no longer had enough space to correct the mistake. Fully 0.12 seconds is not enough time to save a deviation that lasted many minutes. In later investigations, people often asked, what if they had retracted the speed brake sooner? That is an easy question to ask once everything is over. But in the cockpit, amidst the urgent warning and the invisible terrain ahead, humans do not function like a perfect checklist. They react in the order their brain deems most urgent. And sometimes a detail is left behind. The GPWS did its job. It didn't come early, nor did it come late. It came exactly at the moment it was designed for. But that design is based on the assumption that there is still enough altitude and space for the aircraft to escape upward. For Flight 965, that assumption was no longer true. This is a point many outside the industry find hard to accept. Technology cannot always save humans. Technology only warns. The rest depends on what remains: time, altitude, aircraft configuration. When one of those factors has been consumed beforehand, the warning becomes a belated reminder. From the perspective of a journalist who has lived with accident reports for 3 decades, I see this as the most painful moment in the story of Flight 965. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so clear. Everything was correct per the minimum procedure. But correct was not enough when there was no safety margin left. The plane did not crash into the mountain because someone gave up. It proceeded there because the previous chain of deviations had placed it in a position where even the correct response was no longer strong enough. With the speed brakes still open, with the distance measured only in seconds, the thrust could not overcome the terrain. Flight 965 did not lack a warning. It lacked the time to turn that warning into an opportunity. And that is the coldest lesson of aviation. You cannot wait until the system screams at you to start correcting a mistake. By the time the warning sounds, the story has usually reached its final chapter. The end less than 30 kilometers from the runway. After 12 short seconds of warning and an incomplete escape effort, the story of Flight 965 reached its end in a place no one in the cockpit thought they were heading. The Boeing 757 never reached Cali. It stopped on the slopes of Mount El Diluvio, near Buga, less than 30 kilometers, approximate 18 miles, from the intended runway. On an aviation map, that is a tiny distance. In reality, it is the boundary between almost home and completely lost. The impact was not a sudden explosion as outsiders often imagine. It was the final result of a long chain of deviations, each of which seemed reasonable when standing alone. When the aircraft touched the terrain, it no longer had any space to negotiate with physics. The terrain around Cali offers no second chances. The mountains there do not forgive errors. What surprises many in hindsight is the distance: 30 kilometers. For a jet, that is just a few minutes of flight. For human psychology, it is the feeling of being very close. And that very feeling is dangerous. In aviation, accidents often happen not in the first half of the journey, but in the final stretch when people believe the hardest part is over. Flight 965 did not fall in the middle of the ocean or a desert. It stopped right at the doorstep of its destination. This is a type of accident we in the field call arrived but didn't reach, and such incidents always leave an archaic question. Why did it happen when only a little was left? The answer lies in everything that happened before. When the plane drifted from the standard approach path, when it was led toward terrain not designed for a night approach, every advantage began to disappear. By the time the GPWS spoke, the room for error correction was nearly exhausted. Impact was only a matter of time and distance. The subsequent numbers are cold. There were 163 people on board. Only 4 survived. I do not mention them to create tragedy, but to emphasize the severity of the chain of deviations. In aviation, survival numbers often reflect energy levels and impact angles, not luck in the conventional sense. At El Diluvio, conditions did not allow for much leeway. As someone who has followed this industry for over 30 years, I believe this is where the story needs to be looked at directly, without embellishment. This was not an incident of a single moment of panic. It was the result of many minutes, many decisions, and many small maneuvers accumulating. When it all ended, there was no more debate about skill or intent. There was only reality. The aircraft was in the wrong place at the wrong altitude at the wrong time. The 30-kilometer distance to Cali Airport is often mentioned as a bitter detail. But to those in the profession, it carries a different meaning. It shows that an accident doesn't need to happen in a remote or extreme place. It can happen right near the finish line, when humans are tired from processing too many things in a short time, and when the system no longer has room to forgive. El Diluvio was not a famous mountain. Before that, it was just part of the terrain surrounding the Cali Valley, drawn on maps with contour lines and altitude figures. That night, it became the end point for a modern commercial flight, operated by a major airline, with an aircraft considered safe. This leads to a truth the aviation industry has had to face many times. Serious accidents do not require extraordinary conditions. No storm is needed, no rare technical malfunction. Just a long enough chain of deviations and an unforgiving terrain. The 4 survivors do not change the nature of the event. They are not proof that everything was almost okay. They are a reminder of how thin the boundary between living and not living in aviation can sometimes be, and that the majority of others did not have a chance simply because the plane no longer had room to bleed off energy or change direction. When Flight 965 stopped on the slopes of Mount El Diluvio, the story of the flight ended. But the story of the aviation industry did not. Each incident like this forces those in the profession to go back and ask uncomfortable questions. How did the system allow those deviations to happen? Why could a modern flight be led so far off course without being blocked sooner? 30 kilometers, a small number on a map, but a distance long enough to turn an arriving flight into one of the most haunting accidents of the 1990s. And that is exactly why stories like Flight 965 need to be retold. Not to evoke emotion, but to remind us that in aviation, the destination is never guaranteed until the wheels actually touch the ground. Closing the chain of errors, costly lessons from American Airlines 965. As the dust settled on the slopes of El Diluvio, the biggest question was no longer what happened, but why a modern commercial flight could end like that. For those who have followed aviation long enough, the answer rarely lies in a single mistake. And Flight 965 was no exception. The official investigation conclusion later painted a cold but very familiar picture. This was an accident of a chain of small mistakes, occurring in succession over a short period, in a high-pressure environment where every decision had to be made quickly but accurately. First was the navigation error. The aircraft was not lost in the conventional sense. It was still flying according to the commands entered into the system. The problem was, those commands did not reflect the aircraft's actual position relative to the surrounding terrain. In the Cali area, navigation points had similar names, existing side by side in the database. When a wrong point was selected, the system did not object. It just silently did exactly what was requested. Next was the erroneous data entry into the system. This was not a technology failure, but a failure of human-machine interaction. The flight management system at the time was not smart enough to warn that the entered choice could lead the aircraft into a dangerous area. It assumed that humans knew what they were doing. In the vast majority of flights, that assumption is correct. But that night, it wasn't. Then came cockpit workload management. This is a point people outside the industry often find hard to imagine. A cockpit isn't always stressful, but when it gets stressful, everything comes at once. Communicating with ATC, changing approach methods, updating data, monitoring altitude, tracking terrain. Each task individually is familiar, but when piled up, just one step out of sync can cause the entire picture to shift. In this case, the crew no longer had enough mental bandwidth to cross-check everything as they would in ideal conditions. No one completely lost focus. No one left their post, but attention was fragmented. In aviation, fragmented attention is enough to create a deadly gap. When the ground proximity warning sounded, it was the final layer of protection. But the GPWS is not a miracle. It only gives you a few seconds not to think, but to react. The pilots pulled the aircraft up per instinct and training. But the aircraft configuration at that moment did not allow for a climb strong enough. Small technical details, which caused no issues in normal conditions, suddenly became insurmountable barriers. At the time, This accident became the most serious commercial aviation disaster to occur in Colombia. Not because of extreme weather, not because of serious mechanical failure, but because of a chain of decisions that were reasonable if viewed individually, but dangerous when pieced together. The aftermath of Flight 965 did not stop at statistics. It created quiet but profound changes in the industry. Navigation systems were redesigned to reduce confusion between points with duplicate names. Terrain warnings were improved, shifting from late warning to predictive warning. Pilot training was adjusted to emphasize workload management and systemic doubt, even toward the data provided by the aircraft itself. Looking back after more than 30 years of monitoring accident investigations, I can say this: incidents like Flight 965 do not happen because humans are stupid or careless, but because the system allowed small errors to persist too long without being blocked. When every layer of protection thins out at the same time, an accident is only a matter of time. Flight 965 reminds us that in aviation, safety does not come from a single device or one excellent human, but from how the entire system catches errors together before it's too late. When one link weakens, the other links must be strong enough to keep the whole chain from breaking. That night, that chain could not withstand the weight it had to carry.